Jesus told the parable of the talents in both Matthew 25 and Luke 19 with a few different details each time he told it. In Luke 19, Jesus told this parable right before the triumphal entry. And in Matthew 25, Jesus told it again at the end of this week. Luke notes that Jesus' disciples had expected Jesus to bring his kingdom right then. And it starts in Luke with a king going away to be crowned as the king instead of just a master going away on a trip. Jesus is both our king and our master. And the king's subjects in Luke's telling of the story send a group of people after the king to try to prevent him from being made king, but they fail. The king is made king, and he comes back. And at the end of the parable in Luke, in addition to judging how the servants did with his money while he was gone, the king's enemies in Luke's version are executed as the picture of the final judgment. Now, that story, that part of the story of a king going away from Israel to Rome to officially get control of the kingdom and then coming back to reign, and a group of people from Israel going with to say, do not make him king, and then being killed when he came back, happened when King Herod the Great died and his son Herod Antipas became king. So Jesus is mixing in a fairly recent story of this king going away to be made king and coming back. So the reason I'm highlighting those pieces of Luke's telling of this story is to remember the kingly overtones from Luke's telling of the story as we read Matthew's version of this story, where we're talking more of a smaller business relationship between a master and their servants, which is also true of us with Jesus, who is also the king. Okay? So here's the parable of the talents is set up this way. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one, he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went away on his journey. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with 2 talents gained 2 more. But the man who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. This parable starts again, it will be like. We're still talking about God's kingdom, what that will be like when Jesus comes again, as we have in these previous parables, where Jesus came as a thief, a master, a bridegroom, and now as an investor. And the last parable in this section will be as a shepherd. Masters often put their servants in charge of everything they had. You can see this all the way back in the book of Genesis. Abraham had a servant who was put in charge of everything. And then Joseph was put in charge of everything at Potiphar's house and then put in charge of everything in Pharaoh's palace. This is what masters did when they found good servants. They put them in charge of everything. And journeys took a long time in Bible times. And servants worked on your investments for you while you were gone. We've already seen the parable of a master who owned a vineyard who had servants take care of it for him while he was gone. But he went away and he came back. There's a question about which going away and coming back is Jesus talking about. Is Jesus talking about just going away when he dies and rises from the dead? Is he going away for after he's done with his first coming and coming back at his second coming? Or is it talking about both? We've got this picture of Jesus going away and coming back. And then a talent, what he gives them, a talent is a unit of measure of metal that is the name of a unit of money. Like the British pound is a weight that means a unit of money. This would be like calling it a bag o' gold. It's the size of the ingot or bar of gold that's being given to the servants that can't be divided into smaller units. And you could change it in for a different coin, but it's one coin. Now, a talent, this bag of gold, could weigh up to 75 pounds. That would make 1 talent 20 years' wages at minimum wage at that time. That would be roughly equivalent to $624,000 in today's wages. 2 talents would have been 40 years' wages, or $1.25 million, and 5 talents would have been 100 years' wages, or over $3 million today. We're talking huge amounts of money that he's leaving these servants in charge of. And he gave them out according to their ability. Now, in this telling of the story in Matthew, the master gave different servants different amounts of money. In Luke, when Jesus told this story, each servant got the same amount, and it was a much smaller amount of money. So Jesus could tell this story once, where every servant gets the same amount, or he could tell it in him saying, masters are going to give a little bit different amounts to different servants based on what he thinks they can handle. And the master is diversifying his investments here by dividing it 3 ways. And we're going to see that the master was correct about which servant was able to handle the lowest risk in this story also. And his command is to put his money to work, or to trade. Here in Matthew, we only see the result of that. In Luke, that's the command. Put my money to work. Trade my money. In other words, do business of some kind with the money that I'm giving you. Figure out how to start a business, how to do something with this money until I come back. You'll notice that there's no threat of punishment or promise of reward for how well they do in this story. There's just the instruction to use the money in the name of the master until he gets back. And it starts with one of the 2 guys acting at once, investing the money as soon as possible for the maximum reward possible. And when Pastor Dan was praying from this parable, it hit me for the first time that when you're investing money, you actually want a long amount of time for interest to work on your behalf. Maybe that's part of the argument that Jesus waiting to come back is actually a good thing when we're given his money to invest while he's gone. But one of these servants hid his master's money. Now, burying treasure was a normal place to keep it. That would be the equivalent today of saying he put it in a safe. And yet, this does not appear to be what the master had in mind for this money. The master probably was very capable of digging his own hole in the ground, thank you very much, and putting the money there. You guys remember the song from Sesame Street? One of these things is not like the others. One of these things does not belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the others before the time I finish this song? Can you tell which one of these servants is different than the others? The one that hid it instead of trying to do something with it. And the master will be able to tell the difference between his servants and how well they're trusting him by their actions even more easily than we can. If we can tell the difference between these servants this quickly, surely he'll be able to tell the difference. This isn't directly judging his servants by their works, but seeing their faith in what they did with what he gave them. Okay? And we've got this parable of talents still, and we're going to move on to the rewards. After a long time, the master of those servants returned, and he settled accounts with them. The man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with the 2 talents came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. This is after a long time. This is the delay from all those previous parables. And when they talk to him, they call him master, which is a word that means sir, Lord, or the Lord God of the Old Testament, depending on the context. When we talked about this parable in our worship time, Hezekiah told me he thinks he figured it out. that the master is Jesus in this story. And he's right. And that master is a bigger definition of the word master or Lord. It's the biggest definition you can possibly get. That's who Jesus is. He's the Lord. Okay, and then he says, these are faithful servants. This is like the faithful servant in the parable back in Matthew 24. And we still use the word fiduciary and talk about the faith and credit of the United States. And lots of banks have the word trust in their names. We're still talking about faith and faithfulness when you talk about finances. And I don't know about you, but a 100% return on your investment sounds like a pretty good investment here. And did you notice that was the same for the guy he gave 5 to or the guy he gave 2? This word that is used here for he entrusted the money to them, he committed the money to them, is the same word that's used all over Matthew for handing over or turning over or betraying a person into the hands of the law. This is an interesting choice of words to use for this money, showing that it's completely in their control. It's given to them. This money is still the master's, but it's totally under their power. It's a gift to them to use, and 2 of them used it really well. The master entrusted them with the money, but they trusted the master enough to use it. We're going to see that's the different about this third servant. Okay, the reward that they get comes in 2 parts. First, they're put in charge of many things. Congratulations, everyone. If you do a good job being responsible in your life, your reward will be more responsibility. And that's actually a good thing. But the second half is that they will share in their master's happiness. This is the word, not just happiness, but joy. This is the same emotion that the women had after Jesus rose from the dead. They went away afraid yet filled with joy. And Jesus met them and said, "Greetings," which is the word rejoice. It's all the same word. And joy might even specifically refer to feasting, which has been the reward in all of the other parables up until now. Share in your master's joy, his happiness, his feast, his food, all the good things he has. And in Luke, the initial investment was the same for all 10 servants, but the reward was variable depending on how much they made with the money that they had been given. They all received 1, but one guy in Luke earned 10 more instead of just doubling it. And they got that number of cities in response. They were put in charge of that number of cities. Here in Matthew, it's not focused on the exact reward that they get. See, in Luke, there are parables that talk about like differences in rewards when Jesus returns. But in this one, he just says, "Wow, good job with the money. Basically, come on, you can be in charge of everything with me and share in all my happiness." See that? Matthew is not focusing on the differences in the rewards of these servants, but the fact that they get to share with their master. They're rewarded for their faithfulness, not for the exact results that their faithfulness produced. This is similar to the parable of the guys who went out into the vineyard, and some of them worked a little bit of the day and some of them worked a lot of the day, and they all got the same reward. We're seeing that happen here too. They're all getting in on their master's happiness and being in charge of things. We are rewarded by getting Jesus and together with him receiving all things. That's what the picture is here. Jesus is the gift at the start of this story, and getting to keep him is the reward at the end of this story. Everyone who accepts the master's gift and trusts him enough to use it will be rewarded by sharing the master's happiness and will be given other work to do. There will be some differences, which we learn about from other parables, but not enough that anyone will feel left out who is rewarded. We should be careful about doing exact calculations on these works towards ratios. We shouldn't tell Jesus what we think we deserve. We should gratefully accept everything he gives us. There's one major reward in this parable, and that is this master's happiness, which is either shared or lost. This sharing in the master's happiness also shares in being put in charge of other things. That is the one reward that's either won or lost in this parable. And those who miss out on the rewards feel it even more intensely here in Matthew than they did in Luke. In Luke, the people who rejected the master are the ones who get punished at the end of the parable. Here in Matthew, it's the one who rejected the master's gift that is punished at the end of the parable. And since the start of this parable, the servant who buried the treasure has been different than the others. Let's see how different he is as we turn now to the judgment in this parable. Then the man who had received the 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your talent in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvested where I have not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He says to the master, I hid your talent. So why did this servant bury the master's gift? Was he mad at the master for giving him less than he had given to the others? Was he hoping the master would not return and then he could just keep this money for himself? The reason that he gave to his master is that he did not believe his master was a good master. He said, I know that you are hard. He accused his master of being an unreasonable master, the kind of master that Pharaoh was, where he wouldn't give them straw, but still expected bricks from them. The kind of master that Solomon had become by the end of his life, that when they went to Rehoboam and they said, please don't make us work as hard as your dad did on the temple. And Rehoboam said, no, I'm going to be an even harder master. This servant is accusing his master of being that kind of a master. The word hard can also mean cruel. You're a cruel master. And he says, I was afraid. I was afraid of you. That's the opposite of trust. He did not trust his master. And apart from God revealed in Jesus, we have an unknown and scary God. When Paul talked to the Greeks in Acts 17, he said, I've come to tell you about the unknown God. Because as long as we don't know what God is like, all we can do is be scared of his power. We don't know that he's also given his own son to die to save us. We don't know about the gift that God has given us. And he says to his master, here's what belongs to you. This is like saying, I won't be held responsible for this anymore. In other words, this transaction and our business relationship are over. Take your money back. I don't want it. I've done my duty, nothing more, nothing less. This is a form of legalism. I don't want to be judged. I did the bare minimum that I could. I didn't lose anything. There you go. It's yours. He's saying, here's your gift back. I didn't use it because I don't trust you. And the master calls him a wicked servant. Like the servant in the parable who beat the other servants he was supposed to feed while his master was away, was also described as a wicked servant. And last time, that servant was judging his fellow servants too harshly by beating them up, but this time he's judging his master too harshly. I skipped over the fact that the other servants were called faithful servants. You know, the word faithful means full of faith. In other words, trusting, not just trustworthy. What we're talking about here is a breakdown of trust between the master and the servants. This servant did not trust his master enough that he could take risks with the master's money. Okay, so the master says, "You knew, did you?" The master is judging his servant by the servant's own false accusation against his master. This servant wanted to hear that he had done a good job by hiding the money, but the master says that he didn't even do a good job making up a cover story. Even his excuse is bad. The master is actually gracious. He gave them this money as a gift at the beginning of the story, but this master is going to act hard because he's been accused of being hard. You know, we're not judged just directly for breaking or keeping God's law like Adam and Eve were back at the Garden of Eden. Ever since Jesus has come to forgive us of the sin that we already have, now we're judged for rejecting God's grace of forgiving that sin. It's God's grace that's designed to get us to repent. Okay, the master said, you should have at least put this money in the bank. Now, bankers, in the Old Testament law, the Jews were not supposed to charge each other interest, but they could charge non-Jews interest. But we see in the time of the exile in Nehemiah that they often disobeyed this law. This wasn't an interest-free society. And a bank is literally a table like Jesus had overturned at the temple. And the interest rate in Rome at this empire, in the Roman Empire at this time, is estimated at around 12%. But there's stories of people charging up to 50% interest. Ruthless money lending with super high interest is not good, according to the Old Testament. And Jesus comparing himself to someone who is in favor of money lending is like comparing himself to a thief. This is not an excuse for us to be ruthless in business and rip people off whenever we can. But he's saying to this servant, you could have done lots of things that would have been low risk and still given me some reward, but you didn't do any of them. You just buried this money. And then he says, he who has will be given more, but he who does not have, even what he has, will be taken away from him. Does that sound suspiciously like King John's attitude in Robin Hood? Take from the rich to take from the poor to give to the rich. That's not what's going on here. See, God's kingdom in lots of parables is taken away from some in order to give to others who will produce its fruit. This happened in the Old Testament with Saul and David. This happened between Jews and Gentiles. This happened between the healthy or self-righteous or the sick or repentant sinners throughout Matthew. It's being taken from people who are saying, I don't need this gift from you, and therefore I'm not going to use it, and given to those who say, I need it, and then are going to use it. And do you see where this servant ends up in this parable? It's out in the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And some commentators really struggle to accept that this could possibly be what it is throughout all the rest of the book of Matthew. Do you know what this describes throughout the rest of the book of Matthew? This is the picture of hell. Yeah. In this version of the parable, as opposed to Matthew 19, where he just lost the money, again in Luke 19, the servant at the end just loses the money. And it's those who rejected the king were the ones who were the example of God's final judgment by being killed. But here, this servant who refused to use the money is the example of God's final judgment. So was this servant right that the master is an unjust judge who we shouldn't trust? Or is hiding the master's gift really an example of the most serious offense that we could commit? And it deserves God's present and eternal punishment, as we say in our prayer of confession that we prayed today. Let's go back and review the moral of this story. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And throw that worthless servant out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. See, this section of Matthew 24 and 25 here is Jesus' last sermon, and he's wrapping up the entire book of Matthew, and it revisits a lot of Jesus' previous sermons. Do you remember that in the last parable of the wise and foolish virgins, it ended with the same conclusion as the Sermon on the Mount, with some of them saying, "Lord, Lord," and him saying, "I never knew you." That was a review of the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. And now the parable of the talents ends with the same conclusion as the parable of the 4 soils, which ended with, "Everyone who has, more will be given, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away." The same conclusion as that parable. You see, the master here admits that he harvests everywhere, like the sower sowed everywhere. He's the kind of master who does not ask permission to give us gifts or to take our sins or to harvest where others have planted. Everything belongs to him. The servants belong to him. The money belongs to him. We belong to him. The world belongs to him. He can share it as he sees fit at the beginning of the story and at the end of the story. It's all his. Okay, so what's a talent? You know, however we define this talent is determining how these guys are being judged. A talent could mean spiritual gifts, natural gifts, God's law, or the gospel. Could be vague on purpose to include everything that God gives us. It could include everything we own and know and that could use for God's kingdom. Could include the stewardship of literal money and how well we provide for our own families. And we should use our physical resources for the maximum benefit of people. But Jesus also said to store up our treasures in heaven, not on earth. And Jesus says that we lose or use up our lives are the ones who find them. Talents could mean opportunities, responsibilities, or abilities. And the difference in the number of talents doesn't mean that God gives more to those who deserve more, but that God gives everyone enough to do what he's asked them to do. He didn't just say, "Here's 3 cents, do business in my name until I get back." He gave them enough to actually start a business with. Okay, so what are the talents? If there's virtually everything is on the table as a possibility of what these talents are. Do you know that our English word for a talent comes from this parable, not the other way around? You wonder about why we say our abilities are talents. That's an interpretation of this parable that I looked it up. Both R.C. Sproul suggested that, and I actually looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it will tell you that our English word for talent comes from the Greek word for this unit of money because of this parable. But is a talent an ability? Is that the correct way to understand what the master is giving out here? See, the master gave out talents according to everyone's ability, but each person's ability was not the talent in this parable. The master's gift is the talent in this parable. And as with the virgins keeping their lamps burning in the last parable, do you remember that what you took that lamp to be determined how you're saying people are saved? If you took that lamp as being working really hard until Jesus came back, then you would conclude that we're saved by our works. Likewise here, if you take investing your talent wisely to mean working hard enough, you'll conclude that we're saved by works from this parable. Is that what this parable is teaching? You see, the gift of God is the gospel. And putting it to work is accepting and sharing God's grace. In the rest of the New Testament, God's gift is God giving himself to us in his Son and in his Spirit. You can read, I was going to list all of the ways in Romans that it's used this way, but you really have to read the whole book. The gift of God in Romans is forgiveness of sin in Jesus. And looking at this gift from God of the Holy Spirit and his gifts for us to use to serve each other is another thing that's described as God's gift to us. And it says, everyone who has will be given more. The master's original command was not even to make money with his gift, but to put it to work, use it. And God risks everything for his kingdom. And he wants servants who are fellow risk takers, who bet on his grace, but he's willing to judge us by the book if that's what we want instead. See, those lost in these parables all attempt to justify themselves at the final judgment instead of throwing themselves at the mercy of the court. Not one of the people who's lost said, "I'm sorry, I did the wrong thing, please forgive me." None of them. They all say, "It was your fault. You're a hard master. That's why I didn't do anything with the money you gave me." And we can imagine another servant in this parable who tried his best with the money that the master gave him, and he lost it on his investments. We can imagine a character like that, but Jesus can't imagine a character like that. As in the parable of the sower, all of the seed that grows produces a crop. He's saying all you got to do is use this gift and you will make money off of it. There's not a character in this story who tries to use what the master has given that loses it. We aren't even told that the first or second servants worked any harder with the money than the other one did. They just trusted the master enough to take a risk with it, and the risk paid off. And we're judged by whether or not we trust the master enough to accept and use his gift. And yet, all who accept and used his free gift end up producing a profit. Will only be rewarded for putting faith into action, not for the exact results, and will only be punished for the foolishness of unfaith that refuses God's gift. That's what's going on at the end of this parable. So the question is, will we accept and use God's gift in Jesus? Jesus' parables throughout Matthew show that it's hard for us to accept that in Jesus, God promises us these things. God promises to pay us in full, regardless of how much of the day we worked. Remember that parable of the tenants? God promises to feed us a lavish meal just for wearing the fancy wedding clothes that he provided when we come to the wedding. And here, God promises to feed us a lavish meal just for being ready to go with him when he arrives, the parable of the oil. The only people outside of the party in the end of these parables are those foolish enough to reject the free gift that God has given, motivated by the fear that God is a hard judge who will punish us for using his gift. God's not like that. That's a false accusation against him. This brings us to the Lord's table. In all these parables, even in this one, by saying your master's joy, we're talking about being invited to a feast. Jesus is giving us himself as the feast even now. Jesus has always been God. He was sent to earth as a man by his Father, and he obeyed. And Jesus lived a perfect life in your place. You have not lived a perfect life, and neither have I, but Jesus did. He did that in our place. And he died in our place to forgive our sin and to give you his perfect righteousness and the life that he deserves to have. And Jesus ascended into heaven, where he's already been made king. He's already ruling and answering our prayers. And he will return to judge the living and the dead and to reign forever. And we don't know when he will return, but he will reward us for accepting and using his gift while he's been away. Jesus is the gift given for you. Jesus said to his disciples, "Take and eat. This is my body, and this is my blood." given and poured out for the forgiveness of your sin. Take it, eat it, take it, drink it. Jesus is saying, I'm the gift for you. Consume me. Use this gift the way God has designed for us to do. Now, how do we avoid being like the wicked servant here? Don't take God's gift and pretend like you want it and will use it just to bury it so that you can give it back to God at the end, unused when Jesus returns, with excuses about how you didn't do anything wrong and God's the bad one. Instead, we're told to confess our sins, to say, I'm one of those people who needs the gift. I am a person who will die of starvation unless I eat Jesus. Unless I get Jesus' life as my life, I'm toast. And I will gladly accept what God has given, and I will live in the life he's given me, and I won't accuse him of being bad and use that as the reason I'm going to avoid this gift. Pretending is not a good option as we come to Jesus. Here's the gift. In Jesus, all your sin is forgiven. All of it. He is God's gift to you. And he says, take and eat and drink. Jesus is for you. And if you're coming to God that way, he's the one who's inviting you to come to his table.